Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are really pulling back the curtain on how knowledge gets made, specifically in autism research. We're not just looking at what the research is about, but, well, who gets to decide? Who holds the power? Who holds the pen?
Exactly. And our sources today, they're digging into something, well, something a bit uncomfortable, this idea that the modern push for, community involvement, democracy, and research, it might actually be masking the same old institutional power dynamic.
A sophisticated mask, you mean?
That's the argument. The source material actually calls it the lie of consensus.
Yeah.
The core critique is sharp. They say there's no collective vote. Not really. Instead, what we often get is choreography, carefully staged participation. It looks like consent, but is it?
Well, okay. Choreography. Staged consent. And they use this term linguistic capture. What exactly does that mean? Is it just like buzzwords?
It's deeper than just buzzwords, yeah. Linguistic capture is when the language of inclusion words we hear all the time, like co-production, patient-centered, community-led, when that language gets adopted by institutions, but without the actual shape and power. So the words are used to, signal virtue, tick boxes, deflect criticism.
So they capture the language of reform to basically maintain the status quo.
Precisely. The words become a kind of bureaucratic tool, almost a fence around the actual problem rather than a way through it.
Okay. So our mission today is to unpack that choreography. We've got three angles, right? First, how involvement actually gets reported in the big journals. Second, what does it look like when research is genuinely self-sovereign, built from the ground up by the community? And third, how inequity can still creep in like extraction, even when projects say they're participatory.
That's the plan. But before we jump into the studies, we need to set the stage. The context here is, well, it's stark. The sources are incredibly blunt about this. They state, as foundational knowledge, that almost 100% of those with the money and power want cures, want no more autistic babies born.
Wow.
Now, that's a heavy claim, but they argue this underlying drive shapes everything. Funding, priorities, ethics, what even counts as a successful outcome.
Right. So that tension prevention versus acceptance is sort of humming underneath everything else we're going to talk about. It drives the need for this choreography.
Yeah. Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with that idea, you mentioned the word community being used like a spell.
Yeah, like a spell to ward off criticism is how one source put it. And when institutions do talk about involvement, the argument is it often feels like a civilizing mission.
A civilizing mission. How so? Well, think about it. You're invited into a house that's already built without your input. You're given a seat at the table, maybe, and told you should be grateful to be there. But you didn't design the house. You didn't choose the menu. You certainly weren't involved in the foundations. You're expected to fit in, be compliant.
That makes sense. And there's actual data on this, right? An audit of the journal Autism. What did it show about how involvement gets documented?
Yes, that was Tan and colleagues in 2024. And the findings were pretty sobering. They found involvement is overwhelmingly reported as consultative, symbolic, peripheral, not structural. And here's the key thing they found, looking closely. Autistic people, they show up in the acknowledgments, a thank you, but almost never on the author list, which is where the ownership, the actual authority, lies.
So it's what the source calls a choreography of virtue. It looks good, but doesn't change who's in charge.
Exactly. You use the language of inclusion, but the grammar of power remains unchanged. It's a way to satisfy funders, maybe, who asked for community input. You hold a meeting, maybe pay a small fee, list them in the acknowledgments, and you get to borrow their legitimacy for your project, which is still fundamentally driven by the institution's goals, without actually sharing power or money or the final say.
So checking the box for inclusion without any real redistribution of, well, anything that matters. Funding, ownership.
Precisely. And that boils down to a really powerful line from the sources. Inclusion without redistribution becomes the new frontier of compliance. It's efficient, you see. Institutions can perform care, publish guidelines, have advisory panels, but they keep control over the core aims, which, going back to that initial context, often circle back to prevention or normalization.
And this is where it gets potentially quite harmful, right? Not just performative, but actively damaging. The sources talk about the difference between reporting involvement and actually sharing authority. When it's just performance, they say the community is asked to legitimize their own containment. What does that mean?
Think about that phrase, legitimizing containment. It suggests autistic people are brought in to, say, review materials, maybe questionnaires or therapy guides, that are fundamentally based on pathologizing them or normalizing them. They're essentially asked to rubber stamp the tools of their own marginalization. They get a small role, maybe tweaking wording, but not challenging the premise. And by participating, even in that limited way, they lend legitimacy to a system that might ultimately be working against their autonomy.
Okay, that's a pretty bleak picture of the illusion of inclusion.
Yeah.
So let's pivot. What happens when the community doesn't wait for that invitation, when they build their own thing?
Right. This is where we look at the Williams and colleagues study from 2024. It's a fascinating counterexample. They created what they called an insider-only research council, built entirely by and for autistic people. The metaphor they used, which I love, is building our own house.
Building their own house, that sounds powerful. But I mean, how does that work practically? What about funding? Don't they eventually need the institutions?
That's a really important question, and the study acknowledges those challenges. Their initial focus wasn't sustainability in the traditional sense. It was about creating the conditions needed for ethical knowledge creation first. The absolute key concept was trust, treating autistic experience not as a specimen under a microscope, but as the source itself, the place where meaning comes from, mutually.
So the foundation wasn't grant money, it was safety, trust, belonging.
Exactly. They asked what kind of space needs to exist for authentic autistic knowledge to even emerge. That's a very different starting point than how do we fit autistic input into our existing research grant timeline.
Which leads to this idea of narrative sovereignty, owning your own story, defining your own reality.
Absolutely. And if you have narrative sovereignty, the whole process of research has to change. This autistic-led model deliberately resists what institutions usually demand: speed, output, linear deliverables. Academia often wants quick papers, measurable results. This model moves at what the source calls the pace of trust.
Process over performance.
Yes, and coherence over polish. It means honoring how people actually think and communicate, not forcing them into a neurotypical research rhythm. And when you do that, the focus of the research naturally shifts. It's less about diagnosis or fixing autism and more about understanding how to live meaningfully in a world that often isn't built for you. It becomes about building community in its truest and most radical sense, the opposite of the cure economy.
That's a really compelling vision. But okay, let's bring it back down to earth a bit. We need to look at the third study, Verdicius Pelham from 2025, which found problems even in projects trying to be participatory.
Yes, unfortunately. This study involved interviews, and they found a persistent pattern, even in projects labeled community engaged. Community members reported being invited mainly to lend credibility, like ethical decoration, but they were still underpaid, still excluded from decision-making, and felt their presence was often tokenized. The valuable input, the lived experience, it flowed upwards to the researchers. But the credit, the authority, the funding, that stayed right where it started.
So same old power structures, just with nicer language.
That's the argument. The source calls it a managerial rebrand. Consultation becomes little more than a managerial rebrand of the same hierarchies. You change the label, but not the fundamental structure.
And the sources connect this to the idea of extracting labor, emotional, intellectual, under the guise of listening. Academia framing this extraction almost as a virtue, like, look how much we listened.
Right. And this ties into how risk and vulnerability are handled. Often, autistic people are formally designated vulnerable participants by ethics boards. Now, that sounds protective, right? But the critique is that this designation often functions as a form of control. By labeling someone as vulnerable, you justify limiting their role. They become data points, subjects to be protected, not equal collaborators, designers, or authors. It subtly reinforces the idea that the institution knows best and needs to manage the community, perpetuating the power imbalance it claims to mitigate.
Okay, let's make this even more concrete. There's an example in the source material about Gestalt language processing, GLP, and AI. Can you walk us through that? It sounds like a perfect example of this narrative colonization.
Yeah, it's a hypothetical but very pointed example. Imagine querying a large language model, let's call it Consensus GPT, which is trained primarily on established, institutionally funded research. You ask it about the scientific consensus on Gestalt language processing. For listeners, GLP is about understanding how some people, often autistic, learn language in chunks, in whole phrases or gestalts, rather than word by word. It's about validating a different, natural way of processing language, work by people like Prisant, Blanc, Peters.
Okay, so what happens when Consensus GPT weighs in?
Because it's trained on the existing body of published, heavily funded literature, It reproduces the existing power hierarchy perfectly. Studies aligned with applied behavior analysis, ABA, which historically gets vastly more funding, dominate the results. They are presented as the consensus.
And the GLP work, the stuff rooted in clinical practice and autistic experience.
It gets marginalized, dismissed as anecdotal, maybe a small practitioner study. Lacking rigorous evidence by the standards of the dominant paradigm, the AI isn't finding truth, it's aggregating authority. It just reflects and reinforces the biases already baked into the data it was trained on. It shows how the system is self-referential. It defines expert and proof based on who already has power and funding.
A digital echo chamber, basically, reflecting the biases of the research funding world, which really hammers home that point. Representation without sovereignty is just another simulation of democracy. You can be in the room. Your perspective might even be queried by an AI, but if you don't control the narrative, the methods, the definition of evidence, has anything really changed?
Exactly. So pulling these threads together, what do we see? We see the TAN study showing the polite, surface-level theater of inclusion in reporting. We see the Williams study offering a glimpse of what genuine self-determined architecture could look like, even if it's fragile. And we see the Verdacious Pelham study showing how deep the roots of inequity and extraction go, even in supposedly collaborative projects. It really does paint a picture of a choreography of consensus, carefully managed appearances.
And underneath it all, that constant quiet pressure the sources highlight. The bureaucratic serenity of prevention. The idea that the desire for no more autistic babies, that fundamental conflict gets translated into policy, funding priorities, screening protocols, a sort of quiet, data-driven extinction.
It's not necessarily overt, is it? It's woven into the fabric of research priorities, ethical frameworks, definitions of a good outcome, and the performance of inclusion, paradoxically, might make that quiet work easier by deflecting scrutiny. Look, we're involving the community.
But there is resistance. It's not all bleak.
No, absolutely not. That autistic-led architecture, the building our own house model from Williams, that's the quiet defiance. It's the powerful insistence that knowledge has to belong to the people who live it, that alternative structures can exist even against the odds. It's a different form of survival.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, our listeners, straight from the source material. It suggests that maybe the truest form of survival isn't about getting institutional acceptance or partnership even. Maybe it's just presence.
Yeah. Think about what resistance looks like when it's simply the refusal to vanish. How the act of writing, researching, creating knowledge from lived experience, how that itself becomes an act of resistance. Resistance against systems that might prefer difference to just fade away. The sources suggest the democracy the community is building is not yet recognized, but already in motion. It happens every time they refuse the script and choose instead to build their own house.